Christmas Day, they offered only silence. She was the mother they could forget. 7 days later, their perfect world was a wreckage. Suddenly, she was the only call they could make. But did they truly know the woman whose help they now begged for? My name is Evelyn Reed, though few call me that these days. Most just see me as Mrs. Reed, the quiet widow who lives in the two-story colonial on Elm Street, the one whose roses are perhaps a little too perfect, betraying an otherwise understated existence. I'm 68, and for the last 15 years, my life has been a carefully constructed tapestry of predictability. I attend the local book club, tend to my late husband Arthur's cherished garden, and ensure there's always a fresh batch of cookies when my son, David, or my grandchildren, Liam and Chloe, deign to visit. They see me, I suppose, as a gentle anachronism, someone whose most pressing concern is whether the tea is steeped correctly or if the squirrels have been at the bird feeder again. A reliable, slightly solitary figure, content in her suburban cocoon. Arthur was a professor, a kind, brilliant man whose intellect was matched only by his quiet humor. We built a good life, a life that felt full and real. When he passed 5 years ago, the silence in this house became a living entity, one I've tried to fill with routine and the small comforts of domesticity. I wanted simplicity, a stark contrast to a past I'd deliberately locked away. Before I was just mom or grandma, before I was Arthur's wife, I was someone else entirely. Someone whose name once commanded attention in rooms far removed from book clubs and rose gardens. But that was a lifetime ago, or so I told myself. I chose this quiet life, this gentle anonymity, believing it was what I needed, what my family needed from me, a soft place to land, uncomplicated and unassuming. The approach of Christmas always brings a particular ache. Arthur loved this time of year. He'd string lights with meticulous care, humming carols off-key, his enthusiasm infectious. Now, I go through the motions, mostly for the idea of family, for the hope that David, his wife Sarah, and the children might grace me with their presence for more than a fleeting hour. This year, the excuses started early. David called a week before, his voice brisk, already distant. He said, "Mom, things are just insane at work, this new venture, you know how it is. We were thinking, maybe a quick trip to the mountains, just Sarah and me and the kids, to de-stress before the new year. It'll be a very low-key Christmas for us." He promised they'd make it up to me, a proper visit in January, maybe. Sarah echoed his sentiments a day later, her tone overly sweet, almost condescending. She cooed down the line, "Evelyn dear, you understand, don't you? The children have been so looking forward to some snow, and David really needs a break. It's just a tiny getaway. We'll call you on Christmas Day, of course." The of course felt like an afterthought, a social obligation already mentally checked off. I murmured my understanding, my disappointment a familiar knot in my chest. I'd already bought their presents, chosen with care, now destined to sit under the tree, silent witnesses to another holiday spent largely in my own company. I reminded myself that this was the life I'd chosen, this quiet periphery. I told myself their reasons were valid, that I shouldn't be a burden, shouldn't expect more. I've always tried to be supportive, especially of David. His business ventures, often ambitious, rarely seemed to pan out as he envisioned. There were loans over the years, significant sums I'd parted with from the modest inheritance Arthur left, always with the assurance that this time, this was the one. Money I knew, deep down, I'd likely never see again. But he was my son. What mother wouldn't try to help? I'd tell myself it was just money, and family was more important. Yet, as I stood in my kitchen on Christmas Eve, the scent of the turkey I'd insisted on roasting, just in case they changed their minds, filling the empty rooms, a profound loneliness settled over me. It wasn't just the absence of their physical presence, it was the growing awareness of a deeper, more isolating disconnect. The house felt cavernous that Christmas Eve. The tree lights blinked with a cheerfulness that seemed to mock my solitude. I set one place at the dining table, the antique silver Arthur had polished every year gleaming under the soft lamplight. I remembered Christmases past, filled with laughter, with the boisterous energy of a young family, with Arthur's booming laugh as he carved the turkey. Now, there was only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a reminder of the passing time, of moments lost, of a growing chasm between the life I presented and the one I felt deep within my bones. The carefully constructed piece of my retirement felt fragile, almost illusory, that night. I went to bed early, the unspoken words, the unfulfilled hopes, a heavy blanket. This was just how things were, I reasoned. And I, Evelyn Reed, was simply the quiet widow who understood. Or so I pretended. Christmas Day dawned cold and bright, the kind of crisp winter morning Arthur would have loved for a brisk walk after breakfast. I made myself a cup of tea, the silence of the house amplified by the festive expectations of the day. I waited. The hours ticked by. Mid-morning, my phone chimed with a text message from David. "Merry Christmas, Mom. Hope you're having a lovely day. Super busy here, we'll try to call later. Love D, S, L and C." The brevity, the almost dismissive cheerfulness, felt like a small, sharp pebble dropped into the quiet pool of my morning. No call came later that day. Not from David, not from Sarah, not even a rushed greeting from Liam or Chloe. The turkey I'd carved sat largely untouched in the refrigerator. The presents remained under the tree, their festive wrapping a stark contrast to the muted ache in my heart. The days that followed Christmas were a blur of gray sameness, each one compounding the feeling of being utterly forgotten. I tried calling the grandchildren on the 27th, hoping to at least hear their voices, to share a moment of connection however fleeting. Liam answered, his voice muffled, clearly distracted. He said, "Hi Grandma, Merry Christmas." I'm kinda in the middle of a game. Can I call you back?" The clatter of a keyboard and indistinct shouts in the background told me all I needed to know. He never called back. Chloe didn't even answer, her call going straight to a voicemail that was, predictably, full. It was as if I'd become invisible, a ghost in my own family's life, easily dismissed, readily overlooked. I busied myself with small tasks around the house, organizing cupboards that were already immaculate, rereading books I knew by heart, anything to keep the creeping sense of desolation at bay. I told myself they were just busy, that young families had their own lives, their own priorities. But a colder, harder truth began to take root. It wasn't just busyness, it was a fundamental lack of consideration, a casual disregard that cut deeper than any outright cruelty. The quick trip to the mountains seemed to stretch on, an indefinite escape from which I was clearly excluded, not just physically, but emotionally. I found myself thinking of Arthur more than usual, of his unwavering presence, his quiet, steadfast love. How different these holidays felt now, stripped bare of his warmth and the easy companionship we had shared. Then, one afternoon, while scrolling idly through a social media feed, a habit I'd picked up more to feel connected to the outside world than for any real interest, I saw it. Sarah had posted a series of photographs. Not from a low-key cabin in the mountains, but from a lavish ski resort in Aspen. There they were, David, Sarah, Liam, and Chloe, beaming in expensive ski gear, posing in front of a grand lodge, raising champagne flutes in what looked like a very chic restaurant. The caption read, "Best Christmas ever. Soaking up the snow and living our best life. Hashtag blessed, hashtag family time, hashtag Aspen adventures." The images were a punch to the gut. The casual opulence, the carefree smiles, the blatant lie of their insane work schedule and tiny getaway. It wasn't just that they'd chosen not to spend Christmas with me, it was the deliberate deception, the thoughtless flaunting of a life from which I was so thoroughly excluded. A wave of something cold and unfamiliar washed over me. It wasn't just sadness anymore, it was a slow-burning anger, an indignation I hadn't allowed myself to feel for years. All those loans to David, the sacrifices I'd made, the constant effort to be the understanding, undemanding mother and grandmother. For what? To be so easily discarded, so carelessly lied to. The contrast between their vibrant, luxurious holiday and my solitary, quiet Christmas was stark and deeply insulting. I closed the laptop, the images seared into my mind. The carefully constructed facade of my gentle, accepting nature began to crack. This wasn't just a family being busy, this felt like a profound disrespect, a taking for granted that bordered on contempt. The quiet widow on Elm Street was beginning to feel a stir of something long dormant, something that wasn't quiet or gentle at all. That evening, I didn't try to rationalize their behavior. I didn't make excuses for them. I simply sat with the truth of it. My son and his family had chosen a life of superficial pleasures and, it seemed, superficial relationships. My role, it appeared, was to be a convenient, out-of-sight resource, someone to be remembered only when needed, if at all. The cookies I baked, the thoughtful presents I chose, the quiet love I offered, none of it seemed to register, none of it seemed to matter beyond the most cursory acknowledgement. The silence in the house that night felt different. It wasn't just empty, it was charged, expectant. Something had shifted within me, a subtle recalibration of my understanding of my place in their world. The hurt was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but it was now overlaid with a new, unwelcome clarity. And with that clarity came a question: how long would I continue to accept the unacceptable? The week between Christmas and New Year's Eve stretched out, each day a quiet echo of the last. The festive lights in the neighborhood began to look a little tired, their cheerfulness fading. I hadn't heard a word from David or Sarah since the perfunctory Christmas text and my brief, unsatisfying call with Liam. The Aspen photographs remained a vivid, unwelcome image in my mind, a stark reminder of their duplicity. I tried to push it aside, to focus on the small routines that had once brought me comfort, but a restlessness had taken hold, a sense of impending change I couldn't quite name. I found myself wandering through the house, pausing in Arthur's study, running my hand over the worn leather of his favorite armchair. He had always been so perceptive, so adept at seeing beneath the surface. What would he have made of all this? New Year's Eve arrived, and with it, a fresh wave of forced joviality from the outside world. I declined a kind invitation from a neighbor for a small gathering, preferring my own company to polite, superficial conversation. As midnight approached, I sat in my living room, a book unread in my lap, listening to the distant sound of fireworks. My phone, which had been largely silent for days, suddenly blared to life, the ringtone jarring in the quiet room. It was David. My heart gave an odd little thump, a mixture of residual hope and a new, wary caution. I let it ring a few more times before answering, my voice carefully neutral. I said, "Hello, David." His voice, when it finally came, was almost unrecognizable. Gone was the breezy confidence, the dismissive tone. It was tight, strained, laced with a raw, unvarnished panic. He gasped, "Mom? Mom, thank God you answered. We're in trouble. Big trouble." I could hear Sarah sobbing hysterically in the background, a high-pitched, keening sound that set my teeth on edge. My mind flashed to the Aspen pictures, the champagne, the carefree smiles. What could have possibly happened in a few short days to transform that scene into this desperate, panicked call? I kept my voice even, a skill honed long ago in situations far more volatile than this. I asked, "What kind of trouble, David?" He started to babble, words tumbling out in a disjointed, frantic stream. Something about an investment, a new cryptocurrency venture he poured everything into, something that was supposed to be the next big thing. He mentioned federal agents, an investigation, accounts frozen. He choked out, "They were at the house today, Mom. They took computers, papers. They said it was fraud." My blood ran cold. Fraud. The word hung in the air between us, ugly and ominous. Arthur had always been so scrupulous, so utterly ethical in all his dealings. The idea of our family name being connected to something so sordid was abhorrent. Then came the part that made the last vestiges of my carefully constructed composure shatter. David, his voice cracking, pleaded, "We need a lawyer, Mom. A criminal lawyer. Right now. We've called a few. They're either too expensive, or they don't want to touch it. It's bad, Mom. Really bad." He paused, then, with an audacity that was truly breathtaking given the circumstances, he added, "I don't suppose. With Arthur's old university contacts. You might know someone? Someone good, but, not too pricey. Maybe a younger lawyer, looking to make a name for themselves?" The sheer, unadulterated ignorance of his request, the utter blindness to who he was really speaking to, was staggering. After abandoning me on Christmas for a luxurious, deceit-funded ski trip, after years of taking my financial support for granted, after a week of complete silence, this was what he asked of me. The irony was a bitter, searing thing. They needed a lawyer. And they had no idea, truly, no conceivable idea, that the quiet, unassuming mother they'd so carelessly dismissed, the woman they assumed knew nothing beyond her garden and her teacups, had once been one of the most formidable legal minds in the country. In that instant, something within me snapped. Not with a loud crack, but with a cold, decisive click. The pain of their Christmas neglect, the sting of their lies, the years of quiet sacrifices, it all coalesced into a single point of icy clarity. The gentle, accommodating Evelyn Reed, the one who always understood, who always forgave, receded. And in her place, a different woman began to stir. A woman who had faced down far more dangerous adversaries than a panicked, inept son. The game, I realized with a chilling certainty, had just changed. And I was about to rewrite the rules. I let the silence stretch for a moment after David's desperate, clueless plea. Let him squirm in the abyss of his own making. On the other end of the line, I could hear his ragged breathing, Sarah's continued, muffled sobs. The old Evelyn, the one conditioned to soothe and reassure, would have rushed in with comforting words, with promises to help, to fix it. But she was no longer at the helm. A different, colder current was now guiding my responses. When I finally spoke, my voice was devoid of the warmth he was accustomed to, replaced by a calm, almost detached precision that I hadn't consciously used in 15 years. I said, "David, stop panicking. It's counterproductive. Send me everything you have. Every email, every contract, every notice, every piece of paper related to this venture. And I mean everything. Don't hold anything back." He stammered, "Send it? To you, Mom? But why? What are you going to do?" The confusion in his voice was palpable. He was expecting me to tap into Arthur's supposed network of dusty academics, not to take a direct, analytical role. I cut him off, my tone leaving no room for argument. I said, "Just do it, David, now. Compile it, scan it, send it to my email. And until I've had a chance to look at it, you and Sarah are not to speak to anyone else about this. Not the authorities, not your friends, not any other lawyers. Do you understand me?" The unaccustomed authority in my voice seemed to penetrate his panic. He managed a weak, "Why yes, Mom. I understand." "Good," I replied, then hung up, leaving him to grapple with an instruction he clearly didn't comprehend the full implications of. The moment the call ended, a strange energy coursed through me. It was the familiar surge of adrenaline, the focusing of the mind that always preceded a complex case. It had been years, but the instincts were still there, sharp and unerring. My first practical thought, however, wasn't about David's mess, it was about an old friend, a lifeline. I scrolled through my contacts, past the names of book club members and local acquaintances, until I found the one I needed, Marcus Thorne. Marcus and I had started out as rivals in the prosecutor's office, then became grudging colleagues, and eventually, trusted friends who had weathered many legal storms together. He was one of the very few who knew the real Evelyn Reed, the one who could dissect a fraudulent scheme before breakfast. He was retired now too, but I knew his mind was as keen as ever. He answered on the third ring, his voice, though older, still resonant with the same dry wit I remembered. He said, "Evie. Well, this is a surprise. To what do I owe the honor after all these years? Are the Roses finally staging a coup?" I allowed myself a small, grim smile. I replied, "Marcus, I need your ear, and possibly more. It's a family matter. But not the kind you're imagining." I gave him a heavily condensed version of David's predicament, omitting the Christmas abandonment for now, focusing on the potential federal charges. Marcus listened in silence, the kind of silence that meant his formidable brain was already processing, analyzing. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. He said, "Well, your boy certainly knows how to pick 'em. Federal fraud, you say? Not exactly shoplifting, is it?" He paused, then added, "So, the sleeping dragon awakes? What do you need from me, Evie?" "Pelos Vilhos Tempos, anything." His immediate, unquestioning support was like a balm to a wound I hadn't realized was so raw. Just knowing I wouldn't be entirely alone in this, that there was someone who understood the world I was about to re-enter, was immensely fortifying. I told him, for now, just be ready. I'm about to receive a data dump. I might need a second pair of eyes, perhaps some of your old contacts to get a quiet lay of the land regarding the investigating office. He chuckled. He said, consider it done. It'll be like old times, Evie, though hopefully with less terrible coffee. Let me know what you find in the muck. It felt good to laugh, even under these circumstances. As I waited for David's email, a sense of purpose, cold and clear, settled over me. The quiet suburban grandmother was receding, and Dr. Evelyn Reed, J.D., was slowly, methodically, stepping back into the light, not for applause or recognition, but because her family, in their infinite ignorance and desperation, had inadvertently handed her the very case that would force her to reclaim herself. David and Sarah, in the meantime, were a mess of nerves. He called back twice within the hour, his voice still shaky. He asked, Mom, have you got the files? What do you think? Do you know anyone yet? I was firm. I told him, David, I said I would look at them. That requires time. Panicking further will not help your situation. I will be in touch when I have something to say. The clipped, professional tone seemed to throw him off. This wasn't the mother he knew, the one who would offer platitudes and fret alongside him. This was someone different, someone he couldn't quite place, and that, I sensed, made him even more uneasy. Good. A little unease might be precisely what he needed to finally start paying attention. The first set of files began to arrive in my inbox, and as I opened them, the familiar thrill of the hunt, the intellectual challenge, began to stir. The game was afoot. The files David sent were a chaotic mess, a digital representation of his panicked, disorganized mind. But as I began to sift through the jumble of poorly scanned documents, convoluted spreadsheets, and frantic email chains, a grim picture started to emerge. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, dressed up in the alluring jargon of cryptocurrency and decentralized finance, but at its core, as old as greed itself. David, it seemed, had been both a perpetrator and a victim, lured in by promises of astronomical returns, then roping in others with the same reckless enthusiasm, likely pocketing a handsome commission before the whole rotten edifice inevitably collapsed. My legal mind, dormant for so long, kicked into high gear, dissecting clauses, tracing money flows, identifying the key players and the fatal missteps. The skills I had honed over decades in courtrooms and negotiation tables came flooding back as if no time had passed at all. It became apparent very quickly that David was in far deeper than he even realized. He hadn't just been a passive investor, he'd actively promoted this scheme, used his own small business as a front to channel funds, and made wildly misleading claims to other investors, people who were now, no doubt, baying for his blood, or at least their money back. There were promissory notes with his signature, email trails where he assured contacts of guaranteed profits, and bank statements showing large, inexplicable transfers. The Aspen ski trip, I now saw with sickening clarity, was likely funded by the last dregs of this illicit money, a final, desperate fling before the walls closed in. The casual cruelty of their Christmas abandonment took on an even uglier sheen in light of this new understanding. They weren't just vacationing while I sat alone, they were squandering stolen funds. I worked through the night, fueled by black coffee and a cold, methodical anger. The grandmotherly concern I might have felt was completely eclipsed by the prosecutor's disdain for such reckless, amateurish criminality. Arthur would have been appalled, not just by the illegality, but by the sheer stupidity of it. By dawn, I had a clear, damning overview of the situation. David hadn't just made a mistake, he'd waded neck-deep into a federal offense, leaving a trail of evidence a first-year law student could follow. I called Marcus later that morning, my voice crisp and businesslike. I told him, it's worse than we thought. He's not just a bit player. He's an active participant, albeit a foolish one. The paper trail is a disaster. Marcus listened, interjecting with sharp, pertinent questions. He said, so, he's looking at serious charges. Mail fraud, wire fraud, possibly even money laundering depending on how he moved the funds. This isn't going to be a slap on the wrist, Evie. He then shared what his own discreet inquiries had revealed. The lead assistant U.S. attorney on the case was a young, ambitious prosecutor named Alastair Finch, known for being aggressive and media-savvy. He'd be looking to make an example of everyone involved. Marcus added, Finch won't be inclined to leniency, especially if your David was out flaunting it on the ski slopes while his victims were losing their shirts. That kind of optics plays very badly. His words confirmed my own grim assessment. The knowledge of who was leading the prosecution was a crucial piece of the puzzle. I knew the type. Finch would be thorough, relentless, and keen to build a high-profile case. This wouldn't be a negotiation handled with kid gloves. It would require a defense strategy that was equally robust, meticulously prepared, and perhaps a little unorthodox. As I pieced together the timeline of David's involvement, cross-referencing it with his increasingly desperate financial requests to me over the past year, a new layer of betrayal settled in. Those loans I'd given him, the ones for bridging a gap or covering unexpected business expenses, had almost certainly been funneled into this fraudulent scheme, or used to prop up the illusion of his success. I hadn't just been a neglected mother, I'd been an unwitting accomplice to his folly, my generosity exploited to fund his descent into criminality. The weight of these discoveries was immense, yet it also brought a strange kind of focus. The path ahead was fraught with peril for David, but my role in it was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about saving my son from a lengthy prison sentence, it was about salvaging something from the wreckage of his choices, about ensuring that the full force of the law didn't fall disproportionately on him due to his own naivety and the predatory nature of the scheme's architects. It was also, on a far more personal level, about reclaiming my own agency, about using the skills I had worked so hard to acquire, skills I had thought were buried forever, to navigate this crisis. The quiet widow was fully awake now, and the legal battlefield, though daunting, felt strangely, unsettlingly, like coming home. The first step, however, would be the hardest, making David and Sarah understand the true gravity of their situation and the true identity of the woman they had so profoundly underestimated. I let a full day pass after my initial review of David's chaotic files and my conversation with Marcus. I needed him and Sarah to simmer in their anxiety, to fully grasp that their world had tilted on its axis. Then, I called and summoned them to my house. My tone was devoid of maternal softness, carrying instead a cool, professional command they hadn't heard from me before. I simply said, David, Sarah, be at my home tomorrow morning at 10. There are things we need to discuss regarding your situation. Don't be late. There was no room for argument, no polite inquiry about their convenience. They arrived promptly, their faces pale and drawn, etched with fear and sleeplessness. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed, and David looked as if he'd aged a decade in a few days. They sat stiffly on the edge of my sofa, the one usually reserved for quiet evenings with Arthur, now the unwilling stage for this grim family drama. I had subtly rearranged my living room. A few select volumes from my old law library, books on federal criminal procedure, evidence, complex litigation, were now visible on a previously unassuming bookshelf. They'd always been there, part of the backdrop of my life they'd never bothered to truly see. I was dressed not in my usual comfortable gardening clothes, but in a tailored navy dress, simple but conveying an understated authority. I let them sit in silence for a moment, the ticking of the grandfather clock amplifying the tension. Then, I began, not with sympathy, but with a stark, unvarnished assessment of David's legal predicament. I laid out the probable charges: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, explaining the potential penalties, the strength of the evidence I'd already seen in their haphazard collection of documents. My voice was calm, my language precise, each word delivered with the clarity of a seasoned litigator addressing a particularly dim-witted client. David blanched, his hands twisting in his lap. Sarah let out a small, choked sob. He finally managed to stammer, but it was mostly their fault, Mom. The people who got me into this. I was a victim too. I held up a hand, silencing him. I said, David, your naivety and greed made you an easy target, yes. But your actions, your active promotion of this scheme, your misrepresentation to others, your use of your business to facilitate these transactions, those are not the actions of a mere victim. Those are the actions of a co-conspirator, however inept. The law, I'm afraid, will likely see it that way." The room fell silent again, the weight of my words pressing down on them. Desperation was etched on their faces. Sarah finally whispered, "So what do we do? Who can help us? You said you'd look into finding a lawyer." This was the moment. I let my gaze rest on each of them, a long, appraising look. Then, I leaned forward slightly. I said, "The lawyer who has spent the last 36 hours meticulously analyzing your case, David, the one who understands the intricacies of federal fraud statutes, the one who knows precisely what Assistant U.S. Attorney Alistair Finch will be looking for, the one who can anticipate his every move, is sitting right in front of you." I paused, letting the implication sink in. They stared at me, blankly at first, then with a dawning, horrified comprehension. David's jaw literally dropped. Sarah's eyes widened, a flicker of something, disbelief, then perhaps a wild, desperate hope, igniting within them. He finally managed to say, "You, Mom? What? What are you talking about?" I rose slowly and walked over to the bookshelf, pulling down a framed photograph that usually sat hidden behind others. It was a younger me, shaking hands with a former Attorney General, a commendation for my work on a high-profile RICO case. I placed it on the coffee table in front of them. I then retrieved a small, unassuming box from Arthur's desk. Inside, nestled on velvet, were several award plaques and a bar admission certificate for the Supreme Court. I said, for nearly 25 years, before I became just Mom or Arthur's wife, I was Dr. Evelyn Reed, Assistant U.S. Attorney, then partner at Thorne, Blackwood, and Reed, specializing in complex financial crimes. I prosecuted men far more cunning than the ones who roped you in, David. And I defended those who were, perhaps, as foolish. The name might not mean much to you now, but 15 years ago, it was rather well known in certain circles. I imagine if you'd ever bothered to look beyond the surface, you might have stumbled upon it. The silence in the room was absolute, thick with unspoken recriminations and shattered perceptions. The color had drained completely from David's face. He looked at me as if seeing a stranger, a formidable, intimidating stranger who happened to wear his mother's face. Sarah just stared, her mouth agape. The carefully constructed image of the harmless, slightly dotty old lady had just been irrevocably demolished. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been inverted with the force of a controlled detonation. Their desperate search for a lawyer had ended in the most unexpected and, for them, terrifying way. They hadn't just been abandoned by a mother, they had been profoundly, comprehensively, and disastrously ignorant of who she truly was. The Christmas they had chosen to forget me, it turned out, was the least of their miscalculations. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. David looked from the photograph to the plaques, then back to me, his expression a maelstrom of shock, shame, and a dawning, terrible understanding. Sarah seemed to shrink into the sofa, her earlier manipulative tears replaced by a genuine, stunned silence. The carefully curated persona of the quiet widow had been stripped away, revealing the steel beneath. I let them absorb the impact, the full weight of their lifelong oversight. The years of casual dismissal, of treating me as a convenient but ultimately insignificant part of their lives, now cast a harsh, unflattering light on their own characters. This was not just about their legal jeopardy, it was about the profound personal failing of never truly seeing the woman who had given them so much. Finally, David spoke, his voice barely a whisper. He said, I had no idea, Mom. We never knew. I met his gaze, my own unyielding. I replied, No, David, you didn't. Because you never truly looked. You saw what you wanted to see, what was convenient for you to see. A mother who would provide, a grandmother who would dote, someone whose own life, whose own history, was of no real consequence to your ambitions. But that is a discussion for another time. Right now, we have a more pressing matter, your potential indictment. I made it clear that any help from me would come with strict, non-negotiable conditions. First, absolute, unvarnished honesty. Every detail, every sordid transaction, every foolish decision, I needed it all, without embellishment or omission. Second, a complete cessation of their extravagant lifestyle, starting with the immediate sale of any remaining non-essential assets to begin restitution to their victims. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they had to be prepared to face consequences. My role, if I chose to take it on, would be to mitigate the damage, to ensure a just outcome, not to engineer a miraculous escape from all culpability. Sarah, surprisingly, was the first to crack. The fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a weary resignation. She looked at David and said, "Just tell her, David. Tell her everything. It's over." He nodded, defeated. And so, the dam broke. For the next several hours, the sordid tale of greed, naivety, and escalating panic spilled out. I listened, my face impassive, taking meticulous notes, interjecting only with sharp, pointed questions that cut through his attempts at self-pity or deflection. The prosecutor in me was cataloging every admission, every inconsistency, every piece of leverage. The mother in me was grappling with a profound sense of sorrow, not for their predicament, but for the moral vacuum their lives had become. By the end of it, they were exhausted, stripped bare of their pretenses, their arrogance replaced by a palpable fear. In the days that followed, I began to lay the groundwork. I reactivated my bar license, a process that involved more paperwork than I remembered. I reconnected with Marcus Thorne more formally, and he agreed to act as co-counsel, his presence and current contacts invaluable. His firm's resources would also be essential. We began to formulate a strategy, cooperation with the authorities, an attempt to position David as a remorseful, albeit foolish, participant who had been manipulated by more sophisticated criminals higher up the chain. It was a long shot, but it was the only viable path. The transformation in my own life was subtle but profound. The quiet routines of my retirement were now punctuated by late-night legal research, by intense strategy sessions with Marcus, by the rediscovery of a part of myself I thought had been buried forever. There was a grim satisfaction in it, a sense of purpose that had been missing for too long. My relationship with David and Sarah shifted irrevocably. They were no longer my dismissive son and daughter-in-law. They were, in essence, my most challenging clients. They treated me with a new, almost fearful respect, a deference born of their desperate dependence. The grandchildren, Liam and Chloe, were largely kept in the dark about the specifics, told only that their father had made some serious business mistakes. However, Chloe, my granddaughter, began to look at me differently. She had overheard snippets of hushed, anxious conversations, seen the strange new intensity in my demeanor. One afternoon, she found me in Arthur's study, surrounded by legal texts. She asked quietly, "Grandma, who were you?" I looked at her, this young woman on the cusp of adulthood, and saw a genuine curiosity in her eyes, not the dismissive indifference of her parents. I gave her a small, enigmatic smile and said, "Perhaps, Chloe, I'm finally becoming who I was always meant to be, again." A new, tentative connection began to form between us, a fragile bridge built on her dawning awareness and my rediscovered strength. The old Evelyn was gone, and in her place stood someone more complex, more formidable, and in a strange way, more herself than she had been in years. The legal battle was arduous, a slow, grinding process that consumed months. True to his reputation, Assistant U.S. Attorney Alistair Finch was relentless. But he hadn't counted on facing someone like me, someone who knew his playbook, who could anticipate his strategies, and who had an intimate, albeit painful, understanding of the defendant's folly. Marcus was a rock, his sharp legal mind and calm demeanor a perfect counterpoint to my own focused intensity. We worked tirelessly, preparing David for interrogations, negotiating with Finch's office, and meticulously building a case not for innocence that was never on the table, but for a significantly mitigated culpability. David, stripped of his arrogance and terrified of the consequences, was surprisingly compliant, following my instructions to the letter. Sarah, humbled and facing the loss of her comfortable lifestyle, retreated into a quiet, anxious shell. The outcome, when it finally came, was far better than David had any right to expect. No lengthy prison sentence. Instead, a plea deal involving substantial restitution, which meant selling their oversized house and nearly all their luxury possessions, a period of home confinement, extensive community service, and several years of strict probation. He would have a criminal record, a permanent stain, but he would not lose years of his life behind bars. Finch, I believe, was privately impressed and perhaps a little frustrated by the defense we mounted. He'd expected an easy win against a naive defendant, not a strategic battle against seasoned counsel. As the judge read the sentence, I felt not triumph, but a profound weariness, and a quiet, grim satisfaction that justice, in its complex way, had been served. David had been foolish, greedy, and had caused harm, but he was also a product of a system that often rewards recklessness, and he had been manipulated by criminals more seasoned than himself. In the aftermath, life settled into a new, irrevocably altered rhythm. David and Sarah moved into a small rental, their lives drastically downsized. He found a modest job, his first real employment in years that didn't rely on smoke and mirrors. The experience seemed to have genuinely changed him. A measure of humility had replaced his bluster. Our relationship was polite, distant, forever marked by the chasm of his betrayal and my unveiled identity. The easy, unthinking maternal bond was gone, replaced by something more formal, more guarded. He knew, now, that my support was not unconditional, that my respect had to be earned, not assumed. Sarah remained quiet, her focus on rebuilding some semblance of normalcy for her family. Whether any true remorse existed beneath their compliance, only time would tell. My connection with Chloe, however, blossomed. Intrigued by the grandmother she was only just beginning to know, she became a frequent visitor. We'd talk for hours, not just about her life, but about mine, the cases I'd handled, the principles I'd fought for. I saw in her a spark, an intelligence and curiosity that reminded me of a younger version of myself. I started mentoring her, guiding her studies, subtly nurturing her interest in the law. It was a new, unexpected joy, a legacy I hadn't anticipated. Marcus and I remained close, our old friendship rekindled by the shared battle. We'd meet for lunch, dissect current legal events, and reminisce about the old days, two veterans who had found a renewed sense of purpose. I even took on a few pro bono consulting cases for a local legal aid society, keeping my mind sharp, my skills honed, but on my own terms now, driven by a desire to help, not by ambition or necessity. The Christmas following David's sentencing was a quiet affair. He and Sarah and the children came to my house. There were no lavish gifts, no false cheer. It was subdued, almost somber, but there was an undercurrent of something new, a fragile, tentative honesty. David looked me in the eye and thanked me, genuinely, for the first time I could remember. It wasn't absolution, but it was a start. I realized then that the greatest revelation hadn't been my past identity, but the quiet strength I'd rediscovered within myself. The woman who had been left alone on Christmas, the mother they thought they could forget, had not only navigated their storm but had also reclaimed her own power, her own voice. My life now is not the one of quiet retirement I had once envisioned. It's richer, more complex, infused with the purpose I thought I'd left behind. The silence in my house is no longer one of loneliness, but of peaceful contemplation, of a life lived authentically. That forgotten phone call, that desperate plea from a son who didn't know me, was a catalyst. It forced me to confront the comfortable illusions I'd built and to step back into the truth of who I was. And in doing so, I found that Dr. Evelyn Reed wasn't just a memory. She was very much alive, and she still had work to do, not just in the courtroom, but in building a life of genuine meaning and connection, on her own terms. The greatest cases are not always fought in court. Sometimes, they are fought within the quiet confines of one's own heart, for the right to be truly seen, truly valued, and truly oneself. Evelyn's journey shows us that strength often lies dormant, waiting for the right moment to reawaken. If her story of reclaiming her power resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more narratives of resilience and transformation. Your support helps us share these inspiring true stories with the world.